Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Ladies and gentlemen, good morning. Salam Om Swastiastu, Namo Buddhaya, Salam Kebajikan. The Honorable Dean of the Faculty of Social and Political Science, Dr. Erdudi Heriadi, the Honorable Professor Olle Tornquist from University of Oslo, the Honorable Head of Visiting Professor Activities, Lucky Jenny PhD, and the Honorable all leaders and lecturers in FISIP who are present today. First of all, let us express our gratitude for the presence of God who has given us favors and graces so that we can all gather on this sunny day, both in person and at home through virtual Zoom meetings. Now, we will moving forward to our main session for today, discussion session, which will be guided by Mr. Willy Purnasamadi, PhD. As moderator for today, to Mr. Willy Purnasamadi, PhD, we invited you to come forward to lead our discussion for today.
Jalankan satu pertemuan untuk general lecture yang akan dibawakan oleh Profesor Olle Tornquist dari Universitas Oslo, Norwegia. Dan saya sendiri sebetulnya tidak mengasuh mata kuliah ini, politik lokal. Jadi saya sebetulnya tidak cukup banyak mengetahui juga topik-topik apa saja yang dibahas di dalam mata kuliah ini, tetapi tadi saya sempat ajak ngobrol oleh Pak Lucky Jani yang mengasuh mata kuliah ini. Katanya silabus untuk mata kuliah politik lokal kurang lebih isinya soal desentralisasi, kemudian soal gerakan sosial di tingkat lokal, aktor-aktor yang berpengaruh di tingkat lokal dan seterusnya. Tentu saja semuanya dalam kaitannya dengan proyek demokratisasi. So Olle, since I myself do not teach this course in daily for this semester, I don't really know what's in the syllabus, but Dr. Lucky told me that this course is about the topic is about the decentralization issues, the movement in the local area, the actors who influence the local politics and so on. I also don't know what specific issue you will deliver now today.
Everything is exciting. Okay, so, yeah.
But
surprise.
But it's I give it to you.
Yeah, thank you.
To talk. The schedule. We have time until 3 o'clock, I think. 3 o'clock, and there is still one and a half hour for us to be here to discuss together. And also there are some students follow us in the through the Zoom meeting. Then I'll give 47 minutes first.
7.5 minutes, yes.
Yes,
Yes.
47.5 minutes for you first to present, and then we can continue with the discussion.
Yeah.
Please.
Thank you so much.
Oh, sorry, I haven't introduced you, so please introduce yourself.
Yes. I don't know if you have attended any of the previous sessions when I've been here. Anyway, my name is Olle Tornquist. I live in Sweden. I used to work in Sweden first and then in Norway at the University of Oslo. I've been educated as a political scientist and historian, and I've done research and studies together with Luki and with Willy and so on. So we know each other. So that's why we talk to each other in a rather informal way. I've been primarily studying Indonesia since the early 1970s and also India, particularly the state of Kerala, which is in the southwest of India, and also a bit on the Philippines, and made some briefer studies in Brazil and South Africa. And of course I also make comparison with Scandinavia, where I live. So that's about it. I'm not an Indonesianist. I don't speak your language well enough to conduct this in Bahasa. So I think since we can be rather informal here, I will try to speak slow as I do now. So I hope that you can follow. And if there is something you stumble over, you can always, Willy can keep an eye, and you're free to interrupt me, and you can ask Willy to translate. And questions later on, discussion later on, please feel free to ask questions in Bahasa, and we can, if you like, and we can communicate via translation. All right?
Sorry, jadi selama dia presentasi, kalau ada yang nggak jelas mau tanya aja. Tapi nanti setelah presentasi kita tanya jawab, mau pakai bahasa Indonesia bisa silakan.
Okay. So what I will do now is first partly as an historian, political history and economic history and all that, I do think that it's important that we have an historical perspective of what is happening now. So I will apply an historical perspective. I'll talk first about Indonesia, and then I'll make some contrasts to other cases: Brazil, Kerala, South Africa, and then in the end I'll come back to my own context, Scandinavia, in Europe, and we'll try to address the general problem or the general issue of local politics, and whether local politics, whether and how it can sort of be an opening for democratization and more progressive policies. Okay? So next slide, please. So if you turn to slide number 2 would be very good. Thank you. So if we go back, and now we are in Indonesia, so if we go back to the colonial period, we have to keep in mind the structure of governance during the Dutch period. I am sure you know this, but I want to make sure that we are on the same page, as they say. You know, you had a despotic centralism, meaning the colonial state, at the top. And then the Dutch controlled the country through indirect rule. Right? They worked through local strongmen, local rajas, and so on and so forth. And they were cooperating also with top religious and ethnic leaders. That was, you know, in reality, you could say they never really controlled Indonesia. They worked indirectly. This is not just a Dutch principle, it's the typical British way of running their colonies as well. So they co-opted, you can say, forced and co-opted, in quotation mark, traditional rulers, powerful people in Indonesia, and relied on their capacity to domesticate, to control local people, and to extract resources and enforce cultivation. The modern nationalist movement came up with Soekarno-Hatta and Sharir and so on and so forth, opposed this and said that we should have direct state-citizen relations. Shouldn't be that indirect via ethnic, religious leaders and strongmen. And these state-citizen relations should be mediated, linked by citizens' own organizations. And that would be both on the central and local level. Of course, Sukarno was a populist, so he didn't pay much attention to the organization, but so he was this orator who communicated more directly, but initially he was more for organization than he was later. Now, in the process of liberation and then independence, there were of course religious leaders and to a certain extent ethnic leaders. When I talk about ethnic leaders, I talk about traditional leaders like Adat, community leaders like that, who would like to retain their positions. And you know, the conflicts between whether you wanted to have a nation state or whether you want to have a federation, unitary state or a federation, was also partly fought along these lines. And of course those who really wanted to have a continuation of mediation by way of religious and ethnic organizations were in favor of having a religious state. So the Darul Islam movement, for instance, was taking that position. And part of that position is also continues to be taken. Some aspects of that position continues to be taken by some of the religious groups, right, in your country. There was increasing centralism then in the process of conflicts in the mid-1950s, you know, with regional rebellions and conflicts between the various political groups. So guided democracy was scrapping some of the attention to mediation by way of people's own organizations. So instead, the mediation was supposed to be taken through corporatist mediation by way of, you know, what you later on had during the New Order by corporation for women, farmers, teachers, and so on and so forth, labor. But these people were appointed from above, appointed by Sukarno and the army leaders, and later on by Suharto. Then you had a kind of return to the colonial indirect rule in the conflicts in 1965-66. I think that much of the suppression of people, the killings of people, the arrest and all that, can be read in that term, because the Suharto and his military people, to a large extent, apply that form of indirect rule by having a central command, but also relying on local militias and right-wing, often religious groups that carried out the dirty work. It was less of that kind in West Java, around the Siliwangi division. So General Nasution, when I talked to him in 1980, argued that his position and the Siliwangi division was to retain the idea of a central state, not apply Suharto's indirect rule and indirect repression. So he claimed that the reason for why there was less killings in West Java was thanks to that. Then, when Suharto gained power and you got the new order, he returned to the centralism. So much of the local governance was then controlled by the center, all right? And so central level appointments by military commanders to prevent regional opposition was circulating between the various command positions, so that they would never be able to build up a local base and revolt against Jakarta in any way. This is also the period, of course, when there was quite extensive suppression of indigenous communities and their interests, not least in East Indonesia. Next, please. Then we get a kind of attempt, terima kasih, very good. You get an attempt at a more democratic-oriented decentralization after '98. This was really President Habibie's main contribution, you could say, to break up the central command, military command and bureaucratic command, and in a way undermine the possibility of a counter-revolution or a counter-coup by decentralization. And much of the support for the new regime was provided by local leaders of various kinds. Difficult to define them, but they were people who were in any way quite happy to get more influence as compared to the centralism under Suharto. Now, actually, Willy knows much more about this than I know, because he was involved in various projects on local regimes, and of course Luki knows much better than both of us. But one could, I think, say that, you know, these local support for the decentralization was very widespread and constituted the main base for the new regime. The problem related to this was, of course, that local power structures had not been reformed, right? You did not have any land reform, for instance. So in areas where control of land was a vital source of power, that was untouched, so to say. So many of the people who had managed to capture land, occupy land under the New Order regime, retained that land, right? And could use it to gain control on the local level. You also, local businessmen, the same thing. And they got more room of maneuver, so they could strike alliances, they could negotiate with contacts in Jakarta, they could at some point even in raw material rich areas, they could sometimes even negotiate agreements with foreign companies and so on. That was later on kept some checks on. But this is how much of the new wave of corruption emerged in Indonesia. And why you have so many bupatis and so on, and you know, local leaders who are run after by the anti-corruption movement, and why they occasionally are found guilty. You didn't have much of civil society organizations, you didn't have much of popular organization, because they had, you know, the floating mass politics which was applied under Suharto, New Order, meant that people wouldn't organize on their own, aside from what was related to the Golkar Party and the religious organizations. And civil society, in the sense of being citizen-based organization, were also quite limited, because now we're talking civil society meaning organizations based on your citizen rights, not on your religious rights or on your ethnic belonging or something, but your citizenship position and rights. They were also reasonably weak, right? Or rather, quite weak. And that's why they, yeah, it was difficult to relate to the popular organizing. So it was difficult for them to get in control of the new local politics that developed. Rather, you got a resurgence and strengthening of ethnic and religious and identity-based organizations and local powerful groups with access to the new electoral politics and governance. So then they also captured the local resources allotted to the government. And this of course has set this character for the problems of decentralization in Indonesia. But with the opening of direct elections, with the Pilkada, there were new opportunities for people to have a say. This is a bit strange, because direct elections, if you compare with the Philippines, are often paving the way for local bosses, local big bosses that are able to mobilize votes, buy votes, and so on, cheat and whatnot. But the concentration of power in Indonesia was at the time a little bit less extreme than in most places in the Philippines. There are exceptions, of course, but so that meant that in some areas the people who were running in the direct elections could no longer only rely on the parties and negotiate with the parties to win the local elections. They also had to reach out to other groups to get majority in the elections. And that's how we got figures like Jokowi coming up, right? Or Irwandi in Aceh, or yeah. What's the name of the guy that Handoko supported in Batam? Okay, forget about that. But if you know, that was the So it was possible for popular civil society organizations and so on to influence some of the candidates and thus horse trade, set deals with these politicians. Okay. That was also possible for some trade unions because there were the local, the regional wage committees or something, whatever you call them, where you set the minimum wage at a relatively local level. And in return for support from trade unions to a candidate, the candidate would promise to increase the minimum wage. So this way, it was possible for the dissenting group, various civil society organizations, trade unions, and other organizations, to begin to affect more effectively the local politics. And in a way, that's the story of Jukovi, right? And that's why he's described as a new guy, a new phenomenon in Indonesia, in the sense that he does not come from the old elite families or the oligarchs, but he relies on this new opening of local politics, of striking alliances on the local level, and he applies the same principle here on the local level, on the central level. The only troublesome difference is that on the central level he doesn't rely anymore on cooperation with the civil society groups and the popular organization, but strikes his alliances primarily with the political elite and the business people. You also had openings for local parties, but just in one place, in Aceh. That was part of the peace negotiations. You remember after the tsunami, or maybe some of you were rather small kids at that point of time, but you remember, you must have learned about the peace negotiations in Aceh in 2004, 2005 and so on. And the result there was a negotiated peace on the basis that it would be, most of the problems in Aceh would be solved in a democratic way, by way of local politics, by way of giving rights for people to debate and discuss their problems in a democratic way in Aceh. And there would be possibility for them also to build local political parties to take part in that. And that was an opening, and the idea among many people in Indonesia, or many activists, was to see if Aceh could be a role model, a showcase for this, which could then be advocated as a model for other cases. But unfortunately it didn't work out very well in Aceh. And one reason was that the liberation movement, the freedom movement, GAM, dominated one party, one local party, and did not provide opportunities for other local parties, civil society-based parties. So these civil society-based parties never got a chance to reach out to broad sections of the population. And the international actors who had contributed to the rebuilding of Aceh after the tsunami and contributed to the peace process, suddenly said to themselves that they would primarily promote stability in Aceh, so they also did not support the further democratization and good governance in Aceh. They rather preferred to strike deals with Partai Aceh, which was controlled by GAM. And in that process of conflicts of various kinds in Aceh, some of these local parties also began to strike alliances with national-based parties. So, Partai Aceh began to make alliance with this and that Joseph Kalla and others, with other politicians and so on. So the whole local dynamics was distracted by that, and we still live with it. And generally speaking, the reason for why Rwanda was turned corrupt and so on relates to this as well, and why he lost out. Another possibility to do things locally has been to more or less capture formerly national parties, which are quite empty, if you put it like that, don't have a presence in many local areas, but are free to run in the local elections, formally free. You know, the rule is that you must have a national presence. If you manage to make that, you can run in local elections, but local parties cannot just appear like that, only in Aceh. Now, and partly in Papua. Then, but you can capture these kind of national-based parties. My God, I can't remember now. What's this party that was used by Peter Elama? Anyway, this has been used, for instance, in the Moluccas, where civil society activists have entered into these kind of, formal level national parties and used them on the local level and managed to get into local parliaments by acting that way. But they haven't been able to advance further up. So it has not proved very productive, if you like. They have had some say, for instance, in South Moluccas. The general problem is that whatever actors have tried to make their way through the local politics and build alternatives from that level have been short of a strong popular base. And also a policy reform alternative. They have acted, they've been lobbying, they've proposed this and proposed that, they've been striking alliance, they've been building up coalitions with politicians and so on, but no real opposition, no real alternative put forward. Next, please. Let me now turn to some contrasts. In the struggle against apartheid in South Africa, with the African National Congress, Nelson Mandela and so on, there were not just trade unions and the liberation movement, there were also very many so-called civics, citizens movements, citizens organizations that opposed and organized dissidents, organized the people against the apartheid system. They were active in the residential areas. They were, because many of them didn't have permanent employment, so they couldn't take part in some kind of trade union activity in the workplaces, but they organized in the bustings, in the kampungs, and they were very vital and crucial in the anti-apartheid struggle. You could compare some of them with the urban poor organizations like in Indonesia and similar groups there. Yeah. But after they gained, ANC won, and you get Nelson Mandela came to power, there were elections, right? And in the elections, not have a clear position and couldn't really run, right? So they became subordinated to the political organization of the party, ANC. And many people who had been active in the civics got space and room to become candidates for local government positions and central level positions through the ANC. So they, how should you say, they migrated a little bit from the civics into the political level. I'm sure you know that a number of civil society activists in Indonesia have also tried to migrate from their organizations into political parties and into powerful political positions. Now, the effect of that was anyway that the civics, the civil society organizations and so on became dominated by the party. And we did not have a very viable opposition to the ANC. So there was no firm opposition that could check the emerging corruption related to the ANC and the capture of state resources through the ANC. Okay? And people who were not in the trade union movement but based themselves on community organizing and similar things in the bastis, in the kampungs, in the poor communities, they didn't get any real position in negotiations about, development policies and so on. So you have still a depressingly high rate of unemployment in South Africa. These people who are not being represented are losing out, which is of course a tragedy in this country where they actually gain power, the progressive forces gain power. A little bit similar thing happened in Brazil, in Latin America. You probably, Luki has said, or you will say something later on about participatory budgeting in Brazil, where they began in a city called Porto Alegre, where people could participate in setting up local budget priorities. It's the modern form of Musrembang in Indonesia is partly based on these experiences. The only main problem in Indonesia is, of course, that the Musrembang is totally controlled by, subordinated to local administration and so on and so forth. In Porto Alegre, however, you got a institutionalized structure, which meant that the people participating there and the organizations participating there really had a say on the local level. And this spread to many other cities, and it created a vital base for generating a national political alternative with Lula and others Lula became president and so on, right? However, when Lula became president in Brasilia, in the central part of Brazil, and had to negotiate and horse trade with other parties and so on, and they found oil, which contributed to many more resources in Brazil, then you got problems of corruption again. And then these people on the local level participating didn't really have a chance to affect that. There were missing links between the local fine initiatives and what happened on the regional and central level. So this is a crucial problem. How am I doing in terms of time?
Actually, 5 minutes.
I can't make that. I need a little bit more. Okay. So, another example is Kerala, which is in India, which is having the benefit of having long experiences where they made possible a land reform and broad popular organizing and all of that. They have succeeded, and they worked through. They didn't give up on democracy in the 1950s as the progressive groups did in Indonesia. They sustained democracy. They have managed by cooperation with local governments, with the progressive political organizations, to build democratic local governance. There are problems, no doubt, but they have managed to do that. The conditions were better there thanks to consistent democratization, land reform, reducing the power of the elite, and then they could move on. And in the 1990s, there was a new wave of decentralization which was rooted in civil society organizations' initiatives. And this is what has made social democratic politics possible in Kerala. And recently, they have proved absolutely crucial, this local cooperation between civil society organizations and the local governments in fighting natural disasters and the pandemic. Okay, we march on to the next final section. Let me now return to Scandinavia, or not return, let me turn to Scandinavia. I'm returning tomorrow. And do you have an idea where we are? North Europe, on top there. You have this peninsula. With Norway is the rucksack on Sweden, right? And Denmark close on top of Germany, and Finland close to Russia, right? The basic thing, the point of departure is that local governance has a very strong position in Scandinavia and a reasonably well working, even though there are problems, but reasonably well working. Now, why are these conditions there? Why are that? What are the conditions? Well, the history is we have a very long tradition of a strong nation state. If I now limit myself to Sweden and Norway, Sweden has an old history, right, of a strong state. I can't go into that details here. Norway was dominated by Denmark for numerous hundred years, and then became dominated by Sweden. So their nation state is more recent, and their nation state reminds much more of the Indonesian tradition of combining nationalism with democracy and liberties and internationalism and so on, while the Swedish nationalism dates back to our empire. Sweden was an empire at some point of time, fighting way out in Russia and in North Germany and so on. So Swedish national state is much more conservative in its basic structures and its ideology and so on. You could just compare our national hymns, and you will see that the Swedish national hymn is sort of saying, we have a base in our glorious imperial past. It's almost like the British kind of thing, while Norway would talk of their love for their new nation kind of thing. Anyway, way back in time in Sweden, the strong state deteriorated. This was primarily after the empire was undermined. We lost out to the Russians at some point of time and others. So Sweden became terribly corrupt in the 18th century in particular, and increasingly poor. At that time, Sweden was among the most corrupt and poor nation states in Europe, and it continued until the late 19th century. However, there was a strong history of local governments where there were not, like in many other parts of Europe, a feudal structure. So we still had a kind of quite many independent peasants, which could measure up a little bit against the state and the local landlords. And that paved the way for some local independent governance, which was crucial. And there were elements of democracy in that, but many people who were not landed, who were not propertiered, who didn't have property, were excluded. But at least the peasants with their own land could participate in the local governments. Now, the number of people who were excluded increased, right? Because you didn't have a very much of a productive production development. So, you know, when your father passed away, or your father and mother passed away, and who is supposed to inherit the land? And you couldn't divide that between 5 people or something. And if there was no development of economy, where should the others go? So we had growing inequality, we had growing in poverty, and very, very many people migrated to United States, to North America. In the mid and late 19th century, industrialization came up. And there were attempts then to reinvigorate, strengthen the state capacity. So there were bureaucratic reforms. There were attempts to curb production from top down. But it was not just thanks to reform from the top, it was also because they could implement these things because there were these relatively independent local governments. Very unequal, politically very unequal. There was nothing like, the right to vote for those who didn't have property, but there were at least some functioning organizations there. In the late 19th century, there were also growth of civil society organizations among teachers in particular. There were educational movements, there were temperance movements against drinking and that sort of thing. There were movements resisting the state church, because I forgot to say Sweden was, of course, Lutheran Protestant from the 16th century. In the 16th century, the strong rulers expropriated the property of the Catholic Church in Sweden and Norway, looting them and taking the property, which meant that this Protestant church was quite subordinated to the state. The Protestant church didn't have any resources of itself. The only resource they had was to control people ideologically, registering them through religion. And they had the task of registering people. The state didn't register people, the church did on behalf of the state. But what happened then was that when industrialization, you also got labor organizations, not just the liberal organizations, not just the teachers and that sort of people organizing. Now you got the labor movement. And they built their organizations, from kindergarten to burial societies. There were organizations, self-help organizations for everything. And of course, trade unions. There were organizations for amusements, there were organizations for holidays, there were organizations for everything. And that was on the local level. But importantly, all trade unions and all popular organizations had a national structure. So they had a national organization and then they had local chapters, right? So they could have links between the local level and the central level. And they could deal with the state on the central level and base themselves on various issues and capacity to mobilize in various parts of the country. That was very, very important. And when you then built up the welfare state and all of that, through the state and not just these independent organizations, then these organizations could participate in what I call partnership governance. So they could have a say in the policy making and in the implementation of public policies. That created trust in the public governance and some accountability. More recently, that has very much been undermined by the neoliberal-oriented new public management. I stop there. I hope that you by this have gotten a kind of review of the different openings and problems of local government and local governance that can contribute to your studies in this exciting class, in this exciting course. Thank you. Now I hope you have some questions for clarification. If there is something you missed, please ask about it. If you want to comment or if you have something else. Yep, go, please.
Should I open my mask? Sorry, should I open my mask?
Di sini aja kalau gitu. Jadi bisa buka.
Thank you. Okay. Good afternoon, Mr. Olle. Well, my name is Rania Angela, and I'm from the political science major. So you were recalling about the land reform, right?
Sorry, earlier about what? What did I do earlier?
I was going to ask about the Tan Malacca's thoughts about the land reform, because you were actually recalling in the PowerPoint that about land reform and the, local societies and local politics. So, in the thought of Tan Malacca's political philosophy, there are three things that really matters and considered as a what is it called? Sorry. Yeah, I'm so nervous. I'm so sorry. I'm so nervous. Really. So in the thought of Tan Malacca's political philosophy, there are three things that really matter, such the independent and sovereign state, both sovereign such an in and out, and secondly, the transitional state from capitalism to socialist. And the third one is about a just economic system. All means of production, especially the medium and large ones, that the results of all the productions and the distributions are fully controlled by the state for ensure a prosperous society. So my question is actually, do we still need a person such as Tan Malacca to bring justice on local politics and local societies? And also, yeah, such as that. Thank you, that's all from me.
Oh dear, how shall I want to, do all of you know about Tan Malacca? He's a well-known figure for you. You know, he was a communist, huh? He was a socialist. He was a representative of the communist, the Third International, and he was from Minangkabau, wasn't he? Yeah. And this important. Before I try to answer your question, I need to say that one very important aspect of Tan Malacca was that he wanted to build socialist organizations in Indonesia in, how should I say, he wanted to adopt the socialist ideas with and cooperate with not least Muslim organizations, progressive Muslim organizations. So he was then making himself impossible in Moscow. So you know, he wanted to adjust much of the Marxist analysis to the conditions and situations in a country like Indonesia. And he was very much opposed to the communist-led revolt in 1926-27 in Indonesia. He said that was premature. You can't do that kind of thing. You have to do this. So Tan Malacca and the left section of Sarkat Islam were sort of a vital attempt to form a broader front, you could say, at the time, which came to nothing, right? Because the left extremists in Communist parties tried a revolt in 26, 27, and they were repressed and so on. All right, and then Tan Malacca, of course, was a very interesting theoretician and so on. But all this talk about national control of things, state control of things, I never understood, but maybe I'm misinformed or not knowledgeable enough, that was a main point of Tan Malacca in his policies in Indonesia. Of course, you would expropriate Dutch properties and so on, and you would possibly then take over most of the Dutch-run plantations and corporations. But in my understanding, he was not an extremist. He was not nobody who wanted to immediately build a socialist state in Indonesia. He wanted to advance on the basis of the conditions that were here. That's how I read Tan Malacca. But maybe you have other references there that you would like to contribute to our discussion. But I see Tan Malacca as somebody who was trying to adjust to the local conditions and build socialist ideas and policies on the basis of the local conditions. And that he was also very much in favor of education, because he in one way or the I shouldn't excuse him, he talked quite derogatively on the bad state of knowledge among most Indonesians. He thought his own state, Minangkabau, is the best one of them. but the he was a guy who wanted to build on the local conditions. Whatever he then said about state structures, I think was not really, the main priority at the time. That's how I understand it. Is it okay as some kind of answer to your question?
Well, you really answered all my questions and thoughts. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Anyone else? I hope so.
Ada lagi yang
And you can ask questions and make comments and ask clarifications in bahasa, okay?
termasuk yang di Zoom barangkali ya. Saya monitornya gimana?
You are of course also free to ask me to expand on anything which I have tried to say, if you want me to clarify and expand on anything there.
Atau mau lanjut lagi? Mau lanjut bertanya lagi yang tadi?
Belum sih, Pak.
Can I throw out a question to you guys? Yeah. I'm interested in understanding if you feel that local politics, intervening in local politics, is a better way or that there is more chance to build alternatives on the local level than sort of on the national level? Do you see the local level as a window of opportunity? I'll put it that way. Is there anyone who'd like to answer or say what he or she knows about this or thinks about this?
Ya, jadi ada pertanyaan dari Olle, bagaimana pendapat teman-teman tentang pentingnya dinamika politik tingkat lokal untuk membuka banyak peluang untuk perbaikan politik, demokratisasi lain. Menurut teman-teman, seberapa penting kemudian politik lokal itu dalam proses perbaikan politik itu? Atau
well, I hope your silence does not mean that it was so difficult to follow what I was saying that you can't comment on it. Anyway, that's.
But Olle, that actually the question that I want to ask you to add to this meeting today. You presented to us how the dynamics of the local politics historically from the colonial era in Indonesia until now. But I think one remain question need to answer that. Why is it so important for us to know about this? Not to know what is the importance of the local politics then?
Why is it important?
Why is it important? So we can discuss it in the context. So,
well, I think that is I'd like to answer that question in this way, but it's me to refer to India then, because when India was getting independent, Nehru was a social democrat who was trying to change India by way of national coordination of various initiatives. He belonged to the tall leaders, as we say, as Sukarno and Nkrumah in Africa, Nasser in Egypt, and so on. So he was trying to do that on the central level. Now, he felt, and many of the others felt, that on the local level, India was dominated by landlords and by religious leaders and by some, leaders of various castes and so on, right? And he actually did not have the capacity to change that. And the Congress Party, which had been leading the independence movement, just like the Nationalist Party in Indonesia and others, were partly based on a coalition or an alliance with local landowners. So it was very difficult for Nehru to reach out and promote change and local politics like that. So he worked through he took over the British administration. And the British had been, as I told you earlier, despotic colonialism from the top. And the British had been working indirectly with the local leaders, right? Just like the Dutch did here. But Nehru didn't really have the capacity to undermine them, and partly he was drawing on support on that level as well. So the state in India, how does that? The public governance was not really very present on the local level. If you stayed in a village, or even if you stayed in a village, you didn't have any state to fight or to ask things from, really. You couldn't go up to a sort of community office and say, I need this, I need that, why aren't you helping me with that, and so on and so forth. Because it wasn't there. It was dominated by the traditional groups, the traditional landlords, the caste leaders, blah, blah, blah. So if you want to build a democratic nation, if you want to build a democratic nation in Indonesia, you just have to democratize that level and reach out with public governance on the local level, so that people have somewhere to go and raise their demands, stage their protests, and so on and so forth. Do you know the village leader in Indonesia, of course, was somehow elected, but he was elected by the local powerful people dominating that. He wasn't very much publicly accountable. It was the locals who was dominating him, and the local powerful people. It didn't have much to do with democratic politics on the national level, on the state level, and so on. So to democratize the state, you have to change that. And that's what they managed to do in Kerala by this decentralization. They brought out the public administration to the villages. So you had instead of almost nothing of the state budget to the local level administration, in one go, you had 30% of the planning budget, the state planning budget, decentralized to the local level. Now, they wouldn't get that money unless they had local discussions with the villages to make priorities on what to use it for. They had to draw up plans. And that demand and that process was initiated by the civil society organizations I told you about. And these civil society organizations, you see, and their leaders went also into progressive parties. And when the left won an election in 1996, their leaders working in the parties were clever enough to capture the state planning board, kind of Bapenas, right? And the state planning board was quite powerful in Kerala, so they could say, all right, you out there in the local villages and in the districts will now get 30% of the planning budget. That means the investment budget, right? And you can use it for, building bridges or improving irrigation or build schools and do this and that. But you have to have a public discussion in this and that way, which include all the people where they participate in this planning, and if you draw up good plans, we'll give you the money.
But in Indonesia, since the new village law,
Yep.
they already did it, and they also, in the village level, they also have local parliament, BPD, and they also have responsibility to organize the meetings,
Yep.
discussion in village level to discuss about the budget and so
Yep.
on.
So what's the difference? Is
Yeah.
that your question?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, in Indonesia, in the village law, under the village law, they already did it.
Yep.
They already mentioned it, and it's also happened in
Yep.
the village.
Yep.
Every year, they have to have discussion when
Yeah,
they
yeah,
planning the
yeah, I
budget.
know the structure.
Yeah.
The only major difference is that in Kerala, this was controlled, was, how do you say, kept accountable, made use of by popular groups, civil society organizations. The local elites couldn't dominate it because there had been a land reform and so on. The strong parties, the strong organizations in this process were not just the, the middle classes and the political parties, but popular organization, women organization, various cooperatives and so on and so forth. So they could keep some kind of accountability and propel, enginize this process. That's the main difference.
I mean, in Indonesia, it's also current. Yeah,
In Indonesia,
in Indonesia,
yeah, you
it's
have.
also happened since the new village law.
Yeah, you have the new village law, but who makes use of it? Who makes use of it? Who dominates it? What are the social actors, the political actors, who control the implementation?
From the village itself.
Yeah, from the villages,
Who are
the citizens.
Yeah.
So my argument is, from going legislation, that it's wide open for those who are powerful on the local level to make use of this, and less possibilities to, allow others to get into this. If you can, I mean, I was involved in what is it called now again? I've forgotten. This participatory thing, planning, Musrembang. Huh?
Musrembang.
I was following the Musrembang processes in some places, and I understood that much of that was really framed, controlled by the local administration.
Oh, because I also did some research in
Yes.
in some place in North, in NTT, is Nusa Tenggara,
Yeah.
and they did it really. It's really the discussion in their session in the village is very active, and many people are voicing their
Good.
yeah.
Good. That's
And
fine.
the people also very outspoken
Uh-huh.
and very criticize the
Okay,
government.
good.
Yeah, that's why the government also give them budget for, especially for the youth organization, because they said they have activities,
fine.
something like.
But that means that you have a structure which you can, in cases, make some use of. But I presume it calls for these youth organizations and so on to be active, get into it and stage their claims. But just to make another experience like this, we go back to our case of Solo again, when Jokowi came up, that context. When he was, so Jokowi wanted to modernize, develop Solo, right? So he wanted to get rid of all these poor people in the central part of the city who were littering the place, and including a big square, whatever that square is called, a park, something, yeah. And and he wanted to build shopping malls and clean up, and you would get proper place for business and middle classes. That's how he said to the urban poor, you have to move. And they said, no, we are not moving. And there was this upcoming celebration of the national independence, 2 August, and they managed to sit down in the square where the celebrations would be. So he had to do something to get rid of them. And then negotiations started, and so on. But the interesting thing is that when then these negotiations started, it had nothing to do with Muslim Bank. This was because the people, the organizations he had to talk to, that made a difference for him and for the city, were the organizations set up by the urban poor groups themselves. There were the prostitutes, there were the peddlers, there were the this and that. They had various organizations, and they were facilitated to form a coalition by an NGO. So, Jacobi didn't care about Muslim Bank because it didn't help him at all. Muslim Bank made some sense, but it didn't really. And when I asked the people, right, I think I asked an organization of people collecting tickets in buses. So I said, can you make your way through, can you further your interest in the Muslim Bank process? And they said, no, we are not invited. So what I'm suggesting is, that Muslim Bank is not really, it makes some sense sometimes, but it's really not capturing the interests and the organizations and the needs among popular groups in the local areas.
Especially people that don't have any citizen registration, something like that, they also don't have any voice.
Anyway, so that's at least my impression is any other comments? So anyway, question is, why do we care about local governance, local politics? And I say yes, because if we're interested in political governance, if we're interested in how you run a country, because we think that people have something in common and that they should get together to decide what should be run in common and how it should be carried out, there needs to be some kind of local governments, because otherwise it's dominated by the people who own the place, more or less. And in some cases they really own the place. I mean, if you go southern Britain, you could go to very picturesque villages in Cornwall and talk to people in the pub, and you realize that there isn't any functioning local government. Why is that? Because there is a landlord who owns the entire village. Yeah? It's still like that. So, all right. So therefore, local politics is crucial, right? And that's why we run courses about it.
Prof, what do you think about the identity that politicized in Indonesia? Right now, there are many political identity, especially in election. What do you think about that? Especially in local level, because they still elect the leader that have the same identity with them, like the same ethnicity or the same religion or the same clan.
We're talking identity politics now.
Yeah.
Okay. So, I think one basic reason for why we have identity, there are two basic reasons, I think, why the identity politics survive, particularly on the local level, but also, of course, national level. One basic reason is that if you don't have a very well-functioning social security system, you'll have to get your social security in some other way. If you don't have a public social security system, public insurances and all that kind of thing, where do you go? Well, if you're a rich person, you take a private insurance. If you're not a very rich person, you go to the mosque or some other organization that provides some support for people. And how do the mosque get its money? Well, people who would like to gain influence through the mosque, and of course there would be people in the mosque and in the other religious groups that are serious and all that, but they also get money from people who would like to draw on the influence of the mosques, right? So you get, and this money is not just coming from the Saudi Arabia or something, they do come from oligarchs and others in Indonesia. So anyway, the only way of really getting rid of that reason for identity politics is to have a strong and functioning welfare state. Period. It's like that. I was once invited to the Muhammadiyah University in Georgia, and they wanted to talk about welfare state. And what would be the main problems of introducing a welfare state in Indonesia? And I was trying to make a joke with them by saying that you know, I think your organization is a major problem because you provide a lot of support to people, and that means that they turn to you rather than demand public welfare. But that was just to illustrate one problem. Of course, you can combine public welfare systems with other organizations, but then you would have to have, you know, rules and regulations set by a public discourse. So, for instance, if we have a private or cooperative kindergartens, we should play by the same rules as the public kindergartens, and so on, right? That can be arranged, right? But that's a way of upholding identity politics. Is there anyone who wants to know or is interested in understanding why this horrible guy Modi is running India? You know, the Hindu fundamentalist, right-wing populist prime minister in India, right? Why is Hindutva gaining all its influence? What's the source of power? Well, one very vital source of power is the network of community aid organizations in the I tend to use the Indian concept, but in that Hindu fundamentalist group of organizations. Yeah. So they gain their votes just like Hamas in Palestine. They combine militant politics by social security work. That's the brotherhood structure in Egypt. That's how it works. So you know, that sustains identity politics because it serves the interest of strongmen leaders. There may be very good things carried out by Hamas and so on, but anyway, the organization is generating a political leadership which is not necessarily all the time very democratic and peacemaking and everything. That's, you know, that's one thing about identity politics. Another thing is that even, how shall we say, progressive groups may wish to sustain some kind of identities. I like to tell you a story about Jamlian something, Anjo something, Jamlian. He is a guy in, you know where Kachila is in the Moluccas, South Moluccas. Okay, when I came there in 2007, I wanted to understand why it was that I want to understand the relationship between democratization on the local level, and the Adat community organization. how did they coordinate, and what was the structures and so on. So I met this Jamlian, I forgot his first name now, and was sitting there looking quite powerful because he had, and satisfied, because he had just won a village election. And he was an activist guy, he was a progressive activist guy, right? He had just won a village election. So I said, congratulations, you must be very happy, I said. Oh, well, he said, I'm not so sure. So why is that? Didn't you want to be elected in elections? Would you rather have been elected by the clan, by the Adat, within the Adat system, by the clan leaders in the Adat system, right? So he said, yes. And I said, but I thought you were a pro-democrat. Progressive pro-democrats, why are you saying like that? Well, he said, you know, the democratic system is totally captured, hijacked. See, so I'm sitting here. Within half a year or something, the top bureaucrats and the businessmen here, they will have dominated me. They would have seen to it that I can't do almost anything. So you can't just work that way. So they have their power. I have my power, my source of power in the Adat system. So I have to work through the Adat system. The good things in the Adat system, the social trust, cooperation, and the protection of the environmental resources. So if I'm sitting here as a village leader trying to protect exploitation of fishery and take decisions about that because I'm elected, that will not help. They will dominate me. But if the Adat community can go out there and block the fishing waters, then things will happen. So, right, in other words, if you have a democratic system on the local level, which is not really in itself powerful enough to enable those who are elected to really transform the societies, reform the societies, and so on and so forth, they will seek for other sources of power to implement this. And if you don't have land, if you don't have trawlers, if you don't have this and that and that, what is the possibility for people then? Oh, you can draw on your ethnic identity. So of course, I mean, the way out of that is to reform the political system so that getting into democratic power really means that you have some resources and you have some autonomy and are able to do that without having to turn to an Adat community or, you know, identity politics. It's easier said than done, but I think it explains why these things are happening. You know. Okay. Please.
Pak, boleh pakai bahasa Indonesia ya? Soalnya Inggris saya kurang baik. Tadi sempat lihat di PPT soal bagaimana gerakan buruh bisa membuat kehidupan demokrasinya lebih baik karena local government dari pemerintah pusatnya sendiri berusaha mendengarkan hal tersebut. Nah, tadi kita juga udah ngomongin, si Ibu udah ngomongin soal ternyata ada yang namanya dana desa, bahwa itu juga kita berusaha untuk menggapailah suara-suara dari orang desa. Nah, tapi yang ingin saya soroti kan kita kenal tuh namanya urban regime theory, di mana itu ada konfigurasi kekuatan antara pemerintah, civil society dan bisnis. Nah, kita udah ngomongin bahwa dari civil society pemerintah udah berusaha ngasih dana desa. Tapi kelihatannya untuk pergerakan buruh di Indonesia ini agak sulit, apalagi ada undang-undang yang kemarin Omnibus Law, di mana pemerintah membuat seolah-olah mereka lebih berpihak kepada para pebisnis. Dan di sini kan para buruhnya sendiri jadi tidak memiliki nilai tawar, karena ketika mereka hanya sebagai outsourcing atau pegawai kontrak, mereka tidak bisa mendirikan partai buruh di sana karena mereka tidak punya nilai tawar. Perusahaan bisa saja meng-cut mereka jika mereka melakukan tindakan demo, dan itu sering terjadi di perusahaan-perusahaan di Indonesia, terutama di Jakarta. Bagaimana pendapat Bapak tentang bagaimana sih jalan tengahnya ketika kita sadar bahwa gerakan buruh ini sangat berperan, seperti yang tadi Bapak jelaskan, sangat berperan untuk membangun demokrasi. Gerakan civil society ini sangat berpengaruh, sehingga gimana bisa kita bergerak ke demokrasi yang lebih baik ketika pemerintah pusatnya sendiri tidak memberikan ruang yang cukup bagi kita. Apakah kita harus menunggu saja dari pemerintah atau sebenarnya ada cara-cara lain yang bisa kita lakukan? Ya, terima kasih Pak.
Especially after this omnibus law, because omnibus law strongly support one party or the business people.
But is he bringing in local this, or is
Di tingkat lokal atau gimana pertanyaannya, atau gimana? Atau gerakan buruh secara umum?
Saya kira kalau pergerakan buruh di tingkatan lokal di Indonesia kayak kurang kuat Pak, mungkin pertanyaannya di tingkatan buruh itu Pak, karena yang saya amati
According to him, labor movement in local area doesn't really there. So
Yep.
that doesn't really there.
Isn't really there.
Isn't really there. Labor movement in the
All right,
local.
but
According to him.
yeah. There are kind of two questions, because I think that, you know, one of the problem for the labor movement was when the minimum wage regulations, which made it difficult for labor movement to affect local level minimum, I mean province and district minimum wage.
UMR.
Yeah. So that reduced some of the possibilities for the unions to negotiate with the Bupati and the local politicians and the governors about minimum wages. So that reduced the political space for labor. You follow? Yeah.
Jadi salah satu poin yang melemahkan gerakan buruh di tingkat lokal, organisasi buruh di tingkat lokal via Omnibus Law adalah dihapuskannya ketentuan mengenai UMR, sehingga satu ruang negosiasi yang sebelumnya dimiliki oleh serikat-serikat buruh, organisasi buruh untuk bernegosiasi tiap tahun dengan pemerintah lokal itu hilang.
Yeah.
So
Now, I'm not necessarily saying that the very best system would be local minimum wages and all of that. It may well be ideally organized in another way, but it reduced the capacity for labor. Now, how shall I say? My strong opinion and experience when I've written the book which we talked about this morning and so on, you know, In Search of New Social Democracy, I think most experiences suggest that it's difficult for labor, organized labor, meaning people working as more or less permanently employed or semi-permanently employed, to oppose legislations like the Omnibus Law on its own, and build alternative on its own, because there are so many other there are so many other labor groups, so many other, and now I'm talking about informal labor and so on and so forth. And so, you know, only basing oneself on the unions will be very difficult. So and in order to broaden then a kind of unity between unions and other labor groups, to build a stronger front, to build a stronger alliance, and come forward with alternatives, that is extremely difficult. And I have only seen this happening in when they come together in favor of some comprehensive reforms, like the public health reform in Indonesia. So, you know, for good and for bad, the possibility for unions to use local politics with regard to the wage setting, the minimum wage, for good and for bad, that meant that they kept themselves, they said it's enough to have the unions to do this. We can negotiate on that, along that line. They didn't, when doing that, they didn't have to build these broader alliances. But then, of course, immediately that policy is changed and they need to do something else. I think that the opposition to the omnibus law was quite productive in the sense that there were people from the civil society organizations that opposed the undemocratic way of building the omnibus law or legislating it without consultations and without either, but with the employers. I think that was fine. And then of course the various contacts and alliances with the environmentalists who also had aspects of the omnibus law. But there wasn't any alternative. And I think to resist the omnibus law and gain broad, you managed to resist it. You know, you created a response from the government and from the parliament and so on and so forth. So they made all kinds of adjustments and small little negotiations and concessions and so on and so forth. And then in that process the opposition petered out, and there isn't any broad alternative now, right, that can continue this. So in my way of looking at it, the trick must be to continue the opposition of the omnibus law by saying, this is the way we should promote development instead. This is the way we should have consultation and participation in this legislation. And put forward and try to rally people behind such proposals, quite specific proposals. That's the only way I can. You have to broaden that and build up a kind of alternative for it. Otherwise, it will only be resistance, not further on, not ways ahead. That's the only. Yeah, that's the only answer I can give, I think. Yeah.
Sudah dapat atau perlu diulang? Perlu diulang. Iya. Kenapa? Mau tanya lagi satu lagi, tapi sebelumnya ini dulu ya, supaya saya nggak lupa juga. Jadi memang tadi di awal tadi kan Prof. Olle bilang ya setidaknya ya salah satu komponen salah satu substansi dalam omnibus law yang melemahkan menghilangkan kapasitas buruh untuk bernegosiasi adalah soal penghapusan UMR. Tapi memang itu bukan satu-satunya hal yang penting, tetapi setidaknya itu telah mengurangi ruang negosiasi, dan artinya juga mengurangi kapasitas ataupun kesempatan buruh untuk melakukan negosiasi terhadap untuk menegosiasikan kepentingan-kepentingannya. Tetapi saya kira Olle juga menyinggung lantas bagaimana nih kemudian pasca Omnibus Law respon gerakan buruh harus seperti apa, sementara dia melihat juga gerakan buruh itu juga kan tidak tunggal, ada berbagai berbagai organisasi buruh yang juga kemudian di samping harus melakukan respon terhadap ketentuan-ketentuan di dalam Omnibus Law, tantangan yang juga tidak kalah penting untuk diatasi adalah bagaimana menyatukan gerakan buruh ataupun gerakan civil society secara umum gitu. Karena mereka sendiri terdiri dari berbagai organisasi. Maka selain itu juga gerakan buruh tidak bisa bergerak sendiri. Olle menyebut-nyebut soal dibutuhkannya membangun broader alliance, aliansi yang lebih luas, bukan saja dengan sesama organisasi buruh, tetapi dengan organisasi masyarakat sipil lainnya ataupun dengan pihak-pihak lain. Dan tapi juga di samping itu tantangan yang lainnya adalah ini hal yang terakhir yang ditekankan oleh Olle tadi, sampai sejauh ini yang dilakukan oleh gerakan buruh ataupun oleh kebanyakan dari kita para aktivis masyarakat sipil di sini adalah hanya melakukan penolakan, tapi tidak menyodorkan apa alternatifnya. Jadi kita menolak ini, tetapi apa alternatifnya? Tidak pernah ada satu upaya serius untuk menyusun alternatif reform. Ini loh yang kita tawarkan, ini yang ini. Sehingga enggak kalau sekedar menolak mungkin beberapa adjustment tadi Olle bilang, beberapa adjustment itu bisa diterima, diakomodasi kemudian baik oleh pemerintah maupun oleh parlemen, tetapi sifatnya hanya adjustment kecil-kecil. Tetapi kemudian kerangka besar Omnibus Law-nya ya tetap di sana gitu. Nah, oke. He want to follow up the question.
Pertanyaannya kan tadi udah disebutin sama Prof. Olle soal bahwa ternyata government udah nutup satu pintu diskusi soal keterkaitan UMR dan lain sebagainya macamnya, lalu gimana buruhnya sendiri untuk memfollow up tersebut. Pertanyaan saya kan Adorno pernah ngomongin soal spat kapitalisme atau kapitalisme lanjutan, bahwa kapitalisme itu tidak mati, dia akan hadir dengan wajah yang lebih humanis, kayak ya kita kenal namanya corporate social responsibility dan lain sebagainya macamnya. Menurut Bapak spat kapitalisme ini hadir ada nggak sih di Indonesia, sehingga kan kita tahu bahwa ternyata bisnis atau perusahaan ini bisa berkontribusi dalam pembangunan daerah. Apakah spat kapitalisme ini hadir di Indonesia sehingga ya kata Adorno spat kapitalisme lanjutan itu sehingga perusahaan bisa ikut membangun politik lokal, atau itu sebenarnya nggak terjadi di Indonesia? Itu terima kasih Pak.
So the short answer is no. I don't think so, because corporate social responsibility might be all right if the trade unions in the company are involved in the decision making.
Ada pertanyaan online. Biasanya kalau CSR itu kan biasanya ada XR kan Pak. Ada human ada yang ngurusin soal CSR tersebut. Jadi biasanya buruh itu nggak dilibatkan Pak. Jadi apakah karena hal tersebut itu membuat CSR nggak tepat sasaran, atau
Ya kurang lebih jawaban dia yang terakhir barusan gitu. Karena dia bilang nggak bisa kita memanfaatkan CSR.
Keep this private now.
No.
No, it's okay.
Yeah, he asked once again, is it why we cannot use the CSR as an alternative?
Okay.
Uh,
Because what do you think Ahok is doing now?
Ahok, apa yang dia lakukan?
Ahok is using the concept, the idea of public corporate social responsibility to sponsor his loyal organizations, his loyal friends. So many other organizations around here, so many other corporations are sort of pumping in their money in the various organizations, various groups. This is almost like, you know, another way of privatizing welfare. So I think if you want to, there may be situations where corporate social responsibility can work, such as when a Swedish company is exploiting people in Bangladesh or somewhere, and the trade unions in Sweden are getting into that Swedish company and can participate in programs for increasing the wages and so on for the people in the same company in Bangladesh. Then you reach out directly to between the labor there and the company there and the company in some other place. But otherwise, I'm very skeptical of this. But it.
Should government make some regulation for CSR when corporation apakah pemerintah harus membuat semacam aturan gitu supaya CSR-nya tuh melibatkan masyarakat, atau memang enggak atau memang biarkan kesadaran perusahaan sendiri?
I can't details really, because I think this possibility of making use of corporate social responsibility thing depends on the you know, bargaining power of the different actors on different levels and so on. But generally speaking, I think it's better that we operate these things from local and central government, and whatever is done through local corporate social responsibility, that the trade unions are needed to take to control and keep it accountable.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Okay, I think we need to round up, right? Because
But there is one,
Okay.
maybe
One more.
one question. Zoom chat room. It's a long question, but hopefully I can formulate the question in short. Basically, the question is about how your opinion on the Islamic parties in Indonesia to promoting further democratization. So no. Apakah di Indonesia partai Islam dapat mendominasi, atau are Indonesian Islamic Party can dominate the politics, or do you think the Islamic parties are just using Islam as a symbol for their parties, for their organization? I'm not really sure.
Well, this is supposed to be on local politics.
Yeah.
But I think, let me put it like this. In a country where religion is a very, very important part of life, as it is in Indonesia, I think it's unavoidable that that religion is entering into politics. The question is how one does that, or what should be done there. In my opinion, as long as religion is a system of values and norms, how we live together, how we respect each other, and so on and so forth, then I don't think there is a problem with religion in politics. In religious values do have a important place in politics, because politics is about values, is about how we live together, and all of that. So that, I think, is unavoidable and may be productive. There's quite another problem if we, by religion and Islamic parties and so on, or Muslim parties, mean the religious institutions, the organizations, the public their resources, their capacity to organize on the basis of identity rather than on values and public values. Then I think it is a problem. Let me make this clear with another example. When the Catholic Church in the Philippines engaged in support of the People Power Revolution in 1986, they primarily did this on the basis of they said, values for liberties, values for democracy, values for ethical values, etc. That was how the cardinal with the strange name, Cardinal Sin, I don't know if he sinned, but no. Cardinal Sin mobilized people for the People Power demonstration. But when Iglesia Ni Cristo, which is a large religious church, Christian church and sect, or whatever you like to call it in the Philippines, when they are using their vote banks, their money and everything to sponsor certain politicians, then they are intervening in politics in a way which is very dangerous, right? Or to take another example, if you have there's a tradition in Latin America, in particular, among Christian Catholics, in particular, liberation theology, it's usually called. They serve socially and politically on the basis of values about ethic values, human rights, and those sort of things. In 1997, 98 in Jakarta, you had very important such groups defending the right of women and of Chinese people in the demonstration. A guy with the name of Sandiawan was leader there. So there are different ways with religion in politics, religious institutions in politics, and I don't think one can give one straight answer to it. So one has to look into how groups and parties act in this regard. I neither can or should say more than that, I think, here. And I would like to thank you for challenging discussion. It was good for me. I hope it made some sense for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Ya, yang terakhir saya pikir saya juga tidak akan mengulang menyarikannya karena juga temanya di luar dari lokal dari sini. Tapi sekali lagi, thank you very much, Profesor Olle. Kenapa? Oke. tapi harus buru-buru karena dia juga udah mau jalan ya. Jadi kita akhiri pertemuan pada sore hari ini, dan karena Profesor Tornquist juga masih ada acara ke tempat lain dan harus buru-buru, sehingga kalau mau foto kita harus cepat-cepat gitu ya. Selamat sore, terima kasih banyak.
Well, Mr. Willy Purnama Samadi, PhD, as the moderator, guided today's sharing session. I'm Andika Heri, the MC for today. I apologize if there are words or action that are not pleasing. To all attendants, after the event ended, please don't leave the room first because we will doing a photo session. Thank you. Stay safe, stay healthy, and salam bela negara. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Oke, mungkin bapak-bapak, ibu-ibu dosen dan juga teman-teman mahasiswa untuk bisa mengambil tempat.